Hi, thank you everyone. Thanks ever so much for bracing the cold and coming to hear us today. For those of you who for whom this is the first Hayek Society event, firstly a very warm welcome. We're a student society dedicated to discussing ideas around free markets and limited government, first established in 1983. Tonight we're delighted to welcome a very familiar speaker to us, Dr. John Meadowcroft. He is someone who has written very profusely about leading libertarian figures. He's written, for example, on James Buchanan and Robert Logic. In fact, the latter, if we can talk about the small world, was co-edited with my former philosophy tutor, who was also an ex-president of the Oxford Hayek Society. So it comes in circles. But tonight, John's speaking on a somewhat different topic, his most recent research, the logic of far-right activism. So, without further ado, John.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's my second time speaking to the Oxford Hayek Society as well. I'm going to stand up, but also going to have to manually manipulate the PowerPoint. So, yes, when I talk about the far right, so in case anybody wasn't sure what the far right looked like, there's a couple of photographs there that you can find on Google. Well, the far right, they exist in most advanced democratic countries. They tend to be electorally unsuccessful, so we know that the far right tend not to win elections, but they're probably significant for a number of reasons. One reason is that they've become a bit of a precursor for the radical right. Lots of the radical right governments that we see, or parties that have been successful in Western European countries, were once far right parties. The second reason why they're probably important is that they're linked with political violence and terrorism. We can think of the events in Charlottesville last year. We can think about National Action, a far-right group that was banned by the British government for terrorist activities. Maybe there are also a far-right terrorist cell committed a number of murders in Germany in the last decade or so, mainly murders of Turkish immigrants. So it's something that's probably important to try to understand what is happening and why people might join the far right. Well, usually there's a huge literature on the far right trying to explain this kind of activism, and it's usually explained in terms of two things. The first is what we might say is a performance. So there's lots of work, lots of literature on the far right describe this performative aspect that we see here. It's an opportunity for certain types of people, mainly white young men, to perform certain ideas, to perform certain values. A link to that then is it's usually explained in ideological terms. So it's about the appeal of certain ideas to certain types of people. And what I want to do today really is to set out a different sort of explanation. I want to argue that the far right is essentially logical. And this really is not only odds with the academic literature, it's also odds with the way that the far right choose to describe themselves. So some of you may know John Tyndall. John Tyndall was leader of the National Front in two periods between 1972, 1976, and I think 1978 and 1982. He was also the founder and leader of the British National Party from 1982 through to 1999 when he was disposed by Nick Griffin. Well, Tyndall wrote lots of things. Here's a quote from one of his most famous articles in the literature. And he wrote the following, that I believe most people have been won over to our movement in the most committed and active sense of the term, by a personal compulsion, mainly stimulated by some mystical emotive power within us that compels allegiance and participation by an appeal to forces within the human character that defy rational analysis. And this again is relatively consistent with the literature on the far right. This idea there's something mysterious here, it's a performance of ideology, a performance of some deep-seated values. And as I said, what I want to try to argue today is that this is not what's going on at all. There's something much more simple, much more logical that explains why the far right is a presence in all advanced democracies. I think will continue to be so, irrespective of the actions that governments or others might take. So my starting point for my analysis is a very famous book and a very famous approach, which is Michael Rawson's Logic of Collective Action. The basic starting point of the Logic of Collective Action is the following idea. And that is that all political activism faces an inherent collective action problem. And that is because the benefits accrue both to people who participate, contribute, and also to people who don't contribute. So essentially they're supplying a public good. For that reason, each individual has an incentive to free ride on the activism of other people. So if other people engage in this activity, you can get the public benefits, whatever they may be, without incurring the personal costs. There's also a great paper by Gordon Tullock on the same theme, the paradox of revolution. Tullock in that paper argues that people engage in revolutionary activity not to achieve revolutions, but to achieve some personal benefits. And this is this idea, this is Olson's big contribution. How do organisations solve the collective action problem? Well, Olson argued they do so by supplying direct personal benefits to participants. So people engage in collective action not to achieve this collective goal, but to receive and consume direct personal benefits. And that's what's motivated or motivates activism. This has been applied in lots of contexts. So John Aldridge's work on American political parties used the same framework. Ronald Wingtrobe on suicide bombers, anti-terrorist organisations recruit people for very personal reasons. There's a great book again by, I think it's David Brunstein, The Rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1920s, similar framework. Dennis Chong on the US Civil Rights Movement, and lots more. Hitherto, no one's taken this approach and applied it to the far right. So I've done some work with a colleague of mine on the EDL. This is sort of a new second bit of work looking back at the National Front and the British National Party. So, my analysis then is of these two organisations, the National Front and the BNP. I mean, these were the Britain's two most successful far-right organisations or far-right parties. The National Front was not electorally successful. So its biggest electoral success was to save its deposit in a by-election in 1973, but it mobilised thousands of people onto the streets. NF demonstrations in the 70s had 20,000 people there, 15,000 people there, very big events. The BNP, curiously, was less successful mobilising people onto the streets, but was more successful electorally. It won the far right's first election in 1993 in Millwall in London, by-election, and then it elected 2 MEPs in 2009 and won a number of seats on local authorities in Greater London and in Lancashire, I think Burnley and some of the Lancashire towns. And my approach on this work is to engage in a meta-ethnography, which is a posh way really for saying I've read a lot of existing studies. So I've read all the work published at the time, if you like, on the BNP and the National Front. There's lots of books, so Michael Bullock, Nigel Copsey, Nigel Fielding, Matthew Goodwin, who's now become a bit of a celebrity. I think it's, can't remember Scott's first name, and Taylor and Walker. So these books on the National Front and the BNP. What those books have is really great, fine-grained ethnographic data. Most of these people spent time with the NF or the BNP, going to meetings, talking to activists, learned a lot about them. But they all explain what's happening in different ways. So you have what we might call the Rashomon effect. That's the idea, when you have the same event explained by different people in different ways. And there's no plausible way to know which account is correct. They all seem plausible, all using similar data, all have been there, how can we know what's going on? The idea is that we can use meta-ethnography, so we can read all the studies and try to pick out the consistent themes, consistent stories. So that's what I've done. So I've read what I calculate about 600,000 words of text, gauging inductive and deductive coding, so I've recoded all the data, looked for the consistent themes, then engage in descriptive inference, what's going on, to create this new study. So this is what I found from reading everything that's been published, or was published on the NF and the BNP. Well, what the literature tells us firstly is that there's this gap between the esoteric and the esoteric ideologies of the BNP and the National Front. And curiously, we see this in all extremist organisations. So it's the case with the far left as well as the far right. In other words, they have a public face and then they have a private truth, if you like. So the NF and the BNP, they both campaigned on quite a relatively mainstream platform. That platform was to end non-white immigration, to have stronger law and order policies, and to reintroduce capital punishment. Quite a few of the people who wrote about the NF particularly noted how similar it was with the sort of rightist part of the Conservative Party, the public platform. The BNP as well as again having this public face, They also engaged in community politics. So the BNP campaigned in Lancashire for things like more frequent bin collections, better meals on wheels for pensioners, all kind of very prosaic things. In many ways, that's why people voted for the BNP in Burnley, not because they believed in the deep ideology, but for these very prosaic benefits. Now, the public platform, a key thing perhaps, really did reflect a very broad swathe of public opinion. If you look at the survey data on people's views from the 1980s, say, onwards, what you see is a lot of consistency, and that is that about a quarter of the UK population describe themselves as either very racist or fairly racist. That never falls below a quarter throughout that time, all the time that survey's been done in the British Social Attitudes. There's also a very famous study, I think, in 2006, or the Tory study, where they gave the public party platforms and party manifestos without the names attached to them. Which was the most popular party? Was the BNP. 55% of the population supported the BNP manifesto against all the others. So the platform that the NF and the BNP have presented to the public is actually very popular, and it actually reflects a lot of people's opinions. What that platform hides is the real beliefs of the core members of the NF and the BNP. What they really believe is firstly in biological racism. So they believe that white people are superior to people of different colour skin. They also believe in a global Jewish conspiracy to immiserate Britain. So if you ask John Tyndall in private, why do we have black people in Britain? He'll answer because of the Jewish conspiracy. The Jewish conspiracy, according to Tyndall, brought black people here to immiserate the population. And this is the sort of deep, secret belief of both the NF and the BNP. So what I would then argue is that the public face, the exoteric ideology, creates a collective action problem. Because these views are so widely held, anybody can potentially contribute or participate in activism for the NF and BNP. There is, if you like, a collective action problem. It's easy for someone to free ride about refuse collection in Burnley or about strong law and order policies. Lots of people believe that those basic premises. What I think the NF and the BNP did then was to solve this collective action problem by supplying selective incentives to motivate activism. I think there's three basic selective incentives that the NF and the BNP supplied. The first was group solidarity. So in other words, people came together and they gained a benefit of solidarity, of feeling of collectiveness, togetherness, that sort of thing. So attending demonstrations, marching together, this bonded members, marching with flags, sort of nationalist displays, that made that bonding more powerful. It gave people a greater sense of unity, of togetherness. Activism also was linked with socialising. One of, I think it's Fielding's interviewees commented that sooner or later every NF meeting ends up in the pub. The BNP and NF usually met in pubs. They didn't meet in a pub, they'd go to the pub after the meeting. Bizarrely, perhaps looking back, but the National Front was big on cheese and wine, used to organise cheese and wine events at the branches. I can't resist this, which is from Scott's study. He went to a branch meeting which had very little politics discussed, but one of the leading members showed slides of his trip to Everest Base Camp to entertain the other people there. So NF and BNP activism frequently became centred of the members' social life. Members, the friendship networks, the socialised, became centred on the party activism. The second selective incentive then was increased self-esteem. And this may be a slightly trickier benefit. So if you speak to far-right members, and I've done quite a bit of ethnography, I should say, also in the EDL, Britain First, and in Pegida, and actually the Football Lads Alliance as well. If you speak to men activists, they'll never say, oh, I do get it I come for the selective benefits, I come for the friendship and the socialising. They'll explain their activism in terms of politics, but they'll explain their political activism in a certain way, and that is in terms of very general benefits that seem to refer to people close to them. So they'll say, I'm doing this for my kids, for my grandchildren, I'm doing it for my country. Very vague very personal things like the grandkids or the kids, and then very vague and remote things like Britain, my country, things that are sort of ephemeral. What they will never do really is explain how their activism is going to bring about social or or political change. That sort of linked to some broader goal, never really expressed and always quite vague. So Matthew Goodwin writes, I think correctly, that activists internalise what he calls vocabularies of motive. They internalise the party strategy. But I think those vocabularies of motive are very much personal and introspective. They're never really about change and what Britain might look like in the future. It's really about their grandkids, their kids feeling different about themselves. So I think that what activism in the BNP and the National Front gave people was this increased self-esteem, an increased sense, firstly, of self-worth, and secondly, of personal efficacy. In other words, it made people feel better about themselves, and that was clearly an important benefit for many people. The final and third benefit I think activism gave people was access to violence. And we probably know that many people enjoy violence, many people want to participate in violence. But there's quite a bit of research that shows that violence is quite hard to coordinate. Firstly, you want to avoid getting beaten up, because no one wants to get beaten up. Secondly, you want to avoid getting arrested, because no one wants to be arrested. So what you need to do is find other people willing to want to fight with you, and firstly won't run away, if you like, and also won't go too far. So you want some sort of choreographed violence. Football hooliganism, I think we know, provides such a context. Far-right activism provides another context. So a long association of far-right activism and violence goes right back to the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s. They like to fight people on the streets. So did the National Front and the BNP. Two people that like to fight, counter-demonstrators and the police. Lots of opportunities to do so. Really the high point, if you like, or the low point of that violence was in Red Lion Square in 1974, when a counter-demonstrator was killed in fighting with the National Front. So for men who want to participate in violence, far-right activism provides lots of opportunities, lots of chances to fight if you're engaged in far-right activism. So again, one thing that comes across again and again in the research, how many of these people had violent histories? Lots of them had served time for like petty acts of violence, let's say, like for assault, GBH and so on. Lots of them boasted about their violent histories, how they like to beat people up. And the leaders also had a quite ambiguous attitude of violence. They celebrated the ability of the organisation to defend itself. And again, after a violent confrontation, there was lots of debriefing about the violence that had taken place, who had done what, how it happened, if you like, how enjoyable it was, or going over and over again, the sort of violent activity. Hopefully we can see also that these selective incentives are mutually reinforcing. So if you like to fight people, it's probably even better if you're fighting people with your friends, and secondly if you're fighting people in the name of a cause. So it makes the violence more meaningful, more pleasurable, if you like, more efficacious. So these different selective incentives, I think, are reinforcing. Now, of course, activism is costly. So all political activism involves costs of time and money. I think it's clear that the NF and the BNP intentionally made activism as costly as possible. So they demanded that members participate most evenings, most weekends. Branches also were required to be self-funding. They had to pay for all their events. They had to purchase literature from the central organisation. I think the reason why the NF and BNP did this was to try and trap people in. So if every evening you're going to a National Front meeting or out canvassing or leafleting, it gives you very, very little time for other friendships. And therefore you become increasingly dependent upon your NF or BNP circle of friends. That particular network becomes the one that really matters. So I think these people, the leaders of these organisations, understood what they were doing and how to organise and draw people in to the organisation. One thing that's clearly unique about far-right activism is that it involves costs of stigma. Now, even when I think racism is quite prevalent in society, as I think the evidence shows is the case in this society, it's still stigmatising to be publicly racist. And that's for that very reason. If most people are racist, most people know not to say it in public. If you do say it in public, if you do publicly display your racism, then you're open to accusations of gullibility and marginalisation. A person who's open about being racist is seen as a gullible person, a marginal person, if you like, a silly person. So that itself, I think, is stigmatising. And then the logic then is that people will participate when the personal benefits exceed the personal costs. So if these benefits, these selective incentives, if they exceed the personal costs, then we might assume people will participate. Also, we need an opportunity too, but I can't go into that today. That would be too much. So once people are recruited into a far-right organisation, the next stage is the socialisation of those people. So activists who were recruited by these selective incentives, they were then socialised into the group. They were socialised formally. They were required to go to education camps, go to training days. They were required to read nationalist books, consume literature and so on. So they were socialised gradually into the esoteric ideology of the group. They were also informally socialised by being gradually exposed to the real beliefs of the core members. So over a period of time, we gradually, firstly, be persuaded that there was an innate superiority to white people. Secondly, that people of different races couldn't or shouldn't live together. And the final stage of the socialisation was to convince people of the Jewish conspiracy. That was like the final card to be played. When people were exposed to these true beliefs, two things happened. Firstly, most people left. So it's estimated, I think, that about 10,000 people a year in the 70s joined the National Front and left the National Front. It's described in one book as like a bath with the plug hole open, which the water was continually running in and out, in a sense. So very, very high turnover of members. And the same with the BNP, again, very high turnover of members. But some people did remain, and those people then became committed activists. They became gradually socialised into the core ideology. So my contention is that people didn't join the far right because of an ideological commitment. Rather, they became ideologically committed because they joined the far right. So the logic, if you like, works in a slightly different direction. Well, there's a final puzzle. I think it's a puzzle. And that is, what about these people who provided the selective incentives? What about the people who recruited these activists? What was their motivation? It seems unlikely that they were instrumentally motivated, which is a useful explanation, because the benefits of leading a far-right organisation seem to be very small. There's no chance of political power, no chance of elected office. There's no chance, I think, of high status, and quite the opposite. It's a marginalising, stigmatising activity to become a leader of a far-right organisation. We might think maybe there's money in this, but again, I think there's very little money. So John Tyndall, while he was presenting himself as a great man as leader of the National Front, he was also working most of the time as a door-to-door salesman to fund his activities. And the lack of money he had is a consistent theme of his 900-page autobiography. So it seems unlikely that really they were instrumentally motivated. What I think is more likely is that Tyndall and people like Nick Griffin were ideologically committed. I think they were committed ideologues from an early age. Tyndall, again, in his autobiography, writes about walking through London in the 1950s and being repulsed, firstly by seeing black people in London, secondly by seeing Jewish people in London, and thirdly by the architecture, by the art, by the films being shown, the books people were reading. He really hated, if you like, London and everything he saw there in the 1950s. So for people who have these very extreme views, these sort of very extreme racist, conspiratorial views, I think there isn't really a free riding problem. If your views are at the edge of the extremes, then there probably isn't much opportunity to free ride. If they didn't become activists, then I think nobody would have done. So for those people, the logic of collective action is, I think, to participate. So I think the logic is that these people, the committed ideologues, they have incentive to create organisations. If they don't, nobody will. Those organisations then supply selective incentives, and they recruit people who are not hitherto ideologically committed. So this, I think, is the logic of far-right activism. Those with extreme racist beliefs, as I've said, have an incentive to create organisations to represent their views in the political system. They recruit activists by the supply of sets of incentives. The ones I think we find in the literature are group solidarity, increased self-esteem, and access to violence. Those recruits then are exposed to the deep ideology of the party, leading to commitments, of course, in most cases to withdraw. I guess the final thing I'd say, because I think it's relevant, is I think this really applies to all extremes to activism. I think this is the logic of far-left activism, also far-right activism. I think it's the same basic logic, and I think we see the same things at work, both sides of the political extremes.
Thank you.